As the days of summer descend upon us, wait lazy days, beach parties, deep suntans, and of course, insects. We may look forward to seeing grasshoppers jump through meadows and admiring backyard butterflies fluttering through flowers, yet we dread being stung by those yellow and black villains. But the future may bring insects an extra step closer to us, not so much for their stings, but for their food value. I realize this idea of consuming those small, creepy, and sometimes hairy creatures might churn one's stomach and boggle the mind. However, the idea may not seem too unusual once we understand what it involves. As a biology major, I have been enrolled in a course entitled Insects as Food, in which I learned about edible insects people can and do consume. Today I'd like to share some of this information with you by first exposing the presence of insects in our everyday foods. Then we'll consider a history of edible insects, next their nutritional value, and finally we'll see what the possibilities are for making insects a more prevalent part of our diet. To begin, we must realize that while the idea of eating insects may be a new one, we unconsciously consume them with our everyday foods. Ronald Taylor's Butterflies in My Stomach informs us that lettuce, bread, corn, peanut butter, tomato sauces, and fruit juices contain insects or insect fragments. However, these small defects, or if you will, bugs in the food system, should probably not be considered as dangerous as chicken salmonella or other food poisoning. As entomologist Jean DeFoliar, head of the Food Insect Research Division program here on campus explains, unlike the dangerous chemicals in our foods, sometimes the insects in food are more nutritious than the food they are in. In fact, our ancestors relied on insects for mere survival. Taylor also describes a time 1.25 million years ago when we were supposedly apes in the African continent, surviving by eating insects during droughts. More recently, the 1855 Dakota and Utah settlers survived by consuming the very grasshoppers that had plagued their crops. And in 1988, Dr. DeFoliar indicates that in some of the world's tropical areas, people consume insects as part of their daily diet. For example, insects comprise 40% of the protein intake in southern Zaire. Caterpillars are an inexpensive agricultural alternative in China. And the University of Mexico documents 270 insects consumed regularly among rich and poor alike in that country. These and at least 60 other countries use insects in their diets. In fact, their taste and nutritional value make them an excellent food source. Their nutritional value is supported by figures from the Consumer and Food Economics Research Division. As you can see on this chart, if we take 100 grams or a quarter pound or a hamburger-sized portion of cooked meats such as chicken, perch, ham, and beef, the average protein content is 23 grams and the energy content is 240 calories. Now, if we take an equivalent serving portion of cooked caterpillars, termites, and weevils, the average protein content is 15 grams higher, and the energy content is nearly double that of our usual meats. What is more striking is that except for niacin, these insects also surpass the traditional meats in mineral content. In our usual meats, the mineral content may be a few or up to a couple dozen milligrams, whereas in these insects, it may be several or even hundreds of milligrams. However, this idea of using insects for their nutritional value is only that, an idea, unless a market is created. Dr. DeFoliar, who in the next few years plans to introduce edible insects onto the American market, realizes the stomach-churning nature of such topics. Indeed, while individuals who sampled edible insects accepted their taste, the fact that they looked like insects was the major complaint. Therefore, to his team of 25 scientific advisors, he has included food engineers who can pellet and flake insects into more desirable-looking snack foods. Some of his candidates include the dried Akita crickets, the honeybee pupa, and the Galerio larvae, a small caterpillar which tastes like bacon. He will probably also emphasize to the health-minded population that unlike potato chips and French fries, which contain saturated fats, these insects contain the healthier unsaturated fats. Most importantly, Dr. DeFoliar strategically intends to introduce edible insects, not only to the general public, but to those upper echelons who can also afford other odd foods like escargot and caviar, which are no more than snails and fish eggs. The belief is that this approach will cause people to treat edible insects as a status food, as opposed to denouncing them as pet food. Edible insects might also be legitimized by books such as Ronald Taylor and Barbara Carter's Entertaining with Insects, which includes 95 recipes for hors d'oeuvres, entrees, and other uses of insects. In conclusion, I'll admit that the idea may indeed bother some people. Yet we should bear in mind that insects are consumed unconsciously with our everyday foods. Historically, they ensured the survival of some of our most distant ancestors, and currently they nourish many people in various parts of the world. In the future, the possibility of expanding insects as a food source might not receive an available space at every single dinner table. But when we sit down and consider options at feeding the world's hungry, they are likely to be on the table. Given these possibilities, the animal kingdom might eventually experience a sibling rivalry between dogs and insects over who really is humanity's best friend.